Hello again, welcome back. Have you had a nice day at the library? Interesting, informative, and pleasurable, I hope. And so thank you once again for being here. You are the ones who've made it to the end of the day, and or maybe the end of the weekend. So I'm certainly really impressed, and I hope, so I can see people in here who've seen every single session. So hats off to you. You've seen some great writers. So once again, thank you for being here. Thank you to all our partners who've made the weekend possible: Culture Ireland, the Embassy of Ireland in London, and the Doyle Collection Hotel Group, and all the writers who've been here, all the teams, the technical teams, the catering, my staff and my team have been absolutely brilliant all weekend, and I think they've all been with a smile on their faces, so must be doing something right. So I'm just delighted to introduce the final session for the day. When we were programming the event, the first thought was, let's do something on crime fiction. There must be lots of brilliant Irish crime writers, and we contacted a few, and things didn't quite work out the way we wanted. So, and then the focus started getting shifted. It started getting even more interesting, a bit deeper and darker. So it's not a crime writing session. Though there's crime here, there's mystery, there's secrets. So it's not a crime session, but it's a dark session. So, but each of the writers is incredible. They've got really interesting things in their books. So, and the host tonight will be the wonderful Carson. So, who some of you may have been at the panel with earlier on, who claims she's not a crime fan, but I don't believe her. Right, on you go.
Hello, folks. Well done. You have made it to the end of the weekend. You are the remnant who are still standing, and I would probably say you are the best readers that we have because of that. You're very, very welcome this evening to the last panel of the festival, and probably going to be the best one of the festival, I think. My name's Jan. I'm going to be your host for the next hour and 15 minutes. It'll be a very simple format. We're going to hear a little from each of our three guests, a little bit of a reading, bit of a chat, and then, as I always say, it's up to you lot to interrogate them at the end. There's a weird thing in Irish literature where interrogation is a kind of love language. So if you can ask the most difficult questions possible, that would be fantastic. Before we get going, let me introduce our esteemed panel this evening. To my immediate left, McCormack. Mike is an award-winning novelist and short story writer from Mayo. His previous works including Getting It in the Head, Notes from a Coma, which was shortlisted for the BGE Irish Novel of the Year, and Forensic Songs. In 1996, he was awarded the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature for Getting It in the Head, and in 2007 was awarded a Civitella Ranieri Fellowship. In 2016, Solar Bones won the Goldsmiths Prize and was BGE Irish Book of the Year. It was also longlisted for the Booker Prize in 2017 and won the International Dublin Literary Award in 2018. Tonight we're here to talk about This Plague of Souls, which is his fantastic latest novel. In the middle, in the beautiful red blouse, we have Una Mannion. Una is a novelist and short story writer. Her debut novel, A Crooked Tree, was shortlisted for the Irish Book Awards Newcomer of the Year and was one of my favourite books of 2021 as well. The Dalkey Emerging Writer Award, and it was also shortlisted for, or it was winner of the Kate O'Brien Prize. Her second novel, Tell Me What I Am, which came out last year, was shortlisted for the Royal Society of Literature's Encore Award and awarded the prestigious CWA 2024 Gold Dagger Award. In 2024, she was nominated for the An Post Irish Book Awards New Voices 20 Best New Irish Writers, and she's won numerous prizes for her work. And finally, on the far left, which is not a political statement, it's just where he's sitting, is Colin Walsh. Colin grew up in Galway on Ireland's west coast. His first novel, Calla, was published in 2023. It was a #1 international bestseller and won the Irish Book Award for Newcomer of the Year, was shortlisted for the Waterstones Debut Fiction Prize, and named a Book of the Year by a lot of different places. Walsh's short stories have won several awards as well, including the Hennessy Literary Award and the RTE Francis McManus Short Story Prize. In 2019, he was named Hennessy New Irish Writer of the Year, and his work has been published in The Stinging Fly and broadcast on RTE Radio 1 and BBC Radio 4. Folks, can you give a big warm welcome to our three writers this evening? Now, I'm going to begin with a little bit of a general chat before we get into the meat of the novels. And I'm very aware that we have quite a few writers in the audience, so I thought I'd maybe begin with a writing question before we get into the dark heart of the subject. So I wondered, you're all at very different stages in your writing journey. Mike, you've been writing and publishing for quite a long time. I know you're on your second novel. Colin, this is your debut. And I was wondering how your practice has changed over the last number of years writing. And possibly more importantly, what still excites you about writing, which is always a lovely question to answer. I'll maybe begin with Mike.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, folks, for coming. It's wonderful to be here. What excites me and has my practice changed over the years? My practice hasn't changed. I still try and arrive up at the desk every day. I still write longhand. I still write on sheets of paper that one of the things I do is I buy these copies, these A4 copies. They're Clairefontaine. They're white paper, blue lines, red margins. I'm a sucker for red margins. Red margins, and they come in 80 pages. And the first thing I do is I go and I take a pliers to it and I pull out the staples out of it so that I can move the pages out of the book, out of the copy. And I have them open on my desk and I write hither and yon and left, right and center, and I have those pages piling up for quite a long time. And that's a device that has more or less come down to me from the early 90s, from when I started writing my first work. So my first consideration to my wife is a painter, and she uses this phrase about the various drafts that her work goes through. She says, my first consideration. This was my first consideration of this image. So my first consideration of whatever it is that I'm doing, and first, second, and third is always longhand, and always pen and paper, and I have, like every other writer down, I have a pen fetish. It has taken me years to find a pen that actually works and that feels comfortable in my hand, and I have. So that's what I do, and then it's on the third or fourth draft. I computerize it. I do it up in a Word document, and then I take it down and I go through the hand, and I sometimes write it out again and again in longhand. One of my tropes not just as a writer, but as a human being, is repeating myself. I repeat myself, and I repeat myself, and I repeat myself, and it's the thing in my family, like that. I'm allowed to say things twice, but not 3 times. So I have, down the years, I have versions of stories with very, very little difference between them. But they're just kind of, each version is just inched on ever so slightly. So what you might think is a person going round in circles is actually a very gently ascending spiral of gaining on my final kind of end point in that. And the second question you asked was what excites me. There's great freedom in it, in being a writer. Anything can happen, and you are God. You can make anything happen, and there's no other place in the world that you say, okay, there's no rules here. There's no rules. I make the rules, and that's still. There's no other place in my life where I'm that free, and that's always good fun, and that still excites me.
What a lovely way to start the panel, that we all get to be God every day.
Yeah, that's it.
Tell us a wee bit about your practice and what's exciting you at the minute.
Yeah, I wish I arrived at the desk every day and had that discipline, and I'm always telling my students about, arriving at the desk and having a routine. But I think when I started writing, I had 3 kids. my husband was away most of the time, and I worked full time, and writing became something I did, snatch time, and sitting outside discos. I would go to discos to collect my kids. Like, I'd drop them at the disco and wait in the car and lock in, like, writing in the car, writing on the bank when my kids were swimming in the heat and humidity of the pool. I kind of wrote wherever I could. But the real work that I got done was when I would sort of cordon myself off and do like a deep, deep dive for like 2 straight weeks. And I still write like that. I find I'm not that good at like 2 hours in the morning, because I've spent an hour staring at the window thinking, and then another hour staring at the screen. And just when I'm starting to write, the 2 hours are up. So I think I just am one of those people that needs a stretch of time, and it's continued for me like that. And in terms of like the construction, Mike was actually my teacher in Galway. And one day he took his novel and he moved it from one side of the room to the other side of the room, and started talking about looking at the overall structure, like the architecture of your book, and how he does that, and that moving things, and looking for moments where, like, you mentioned a character in chapter 2 and they haven't appeared again. And I started using Post-its, so I always have my novel done out on Post-its, sometimes in different colors for different voices, and use a wall so that I can move things around structurally. So that's as close to a practice as I have. And in terms of what excites me, I think I love research. I love like reading and discovering something, and it just sings in a way that it somehow symbolizes what I'm trying to work through in my book, and I love when that happens. Where the research is kind of informing, I could just be researching, like in this book I was writing about, I was part of it set in Vermont, and I was researching about flora and fauna in Vermont, and that just started to like feed into what I was writing, like at a symbolic level. But I love just those gifts, like when you're out walking or driving and you're thinking about the characters and something falls from the sky, or what, and you can't wait to go back to the computer because you got this gift dropped on you.
If only it happened more.
I always think of the Sylvia Plath poem, Black Rook in rainy weather, waiting for the angel to flare at her elbow, and just the misery of there, and the hunched rook in the rain, and everything, the season of numbness, or that, and then something comes, which does feel like a gift.
Just one of the things you mentioned there about, isn't the car a great place to write?
Yes.
I came late to many thing in my life, and one of the things I came late to was fatherhood, was parenthood, and I have a child now who's 10 years old, and outside the tennis court, outside, he goes in playing tennis, and I'm outside in the car park, right? And it's I'd recommend it to anyone. Yes. It's a great place. And I had a sheet of, when I started my first book, I had a sheet of plywood. And it's about I don't know, about 20 inches square, and I wrote my first book on that. And when I think back on it, I wrote it in a room which is about 10 foot square, with 4 or 5 other lads in it, and every one of us smoked. And we could hardly see each other. We went fucking right. But one of the things, the sheet of plywood has followed me around. I still have it, but I have to get it amended now because you can't actually use it in the car. It's just a bit too big. So I might have to get it. I might have to take the saw out to it and amend it. But it was just when you mentioned the car there that I thought, yeah, I'm beginning to discover that it's a great place.
I think writers often have constraints in their life and they find them really helpful. Colin, would you have constraints that help your practice like that?
Yeah, I mean, like in terms of like a practice, like really, for me at least, it depends on where you are within a project as well, like how far in you are or whatever. Like, sometimes, like you were talking there about constraints, if you're at the very beginning of something, a lot of the time you have so little, you have nothing essentially at the start, you know. You might have an image or, you know, a phrase or an exchange of dialogue or something like that, something that has some kind of pulse that's making you want to kind of go into it a bit more. And there your constraint is actually, like, at least for me, it's your stamina or something, that you can't spend 8 hours on, like, an initial throb of an idea or something. Like, you need a lot of slow incremental building of those little bits until you have more of a sense of what you're doing, and then you can kind of be doing a full day because you have more of a sense of what you're working on. Yeah. So, like, even like within just the writing of the novel, like, the process changed so many times depending on where I was in the project, you know. So there are always constraints, but constraints are, like, you know, it's that thing of, like, you know, without constraint there's no freedom, you know, that cliche, but it's true. You need limits, you need some sort of guardrails within which you can kind of move. But, like, then when it comes to this thing of, like, what's exciting or whatever, for me it's always, you know, what you were saying there, Una, about, like, when something just seems to fall, you know, from out of nowhere. And that's kind of like the flip, that is the natural flip side to all of those tedious long hours where nothing is working and it's like just wading through treacle and you're just getting nowhere and you feel really disheartened or whatever. That's like an essential part of, like, the other side is when, you know, this kind of epiphany happens, or this sort of, you know, something clicks into place. There's a flash of ideas that sort of set off a chain reaction, and then you're kind of flying. And you can't have one of those without the other, you know, they're both completely bound up in one another. But, like, the most exciting thing for me is the thing that happens while you're at the desk. Like, when I'm not working, I'm still always thinking about what I'm working on, when you're doing the dishes, when you're in the car. But, like, when you're actually at the desk, when you are writing, and then something happens on the page that you didn't anticipate at all. Like, an example of that, like in this book, would be there's an early chapter narrated by a character named Mush, and he works in his mother's cafe, and then at a certain point, these two girls walk into the cafe, and they're his cousins. Like, I didn't. They showed up. They kind of came in, and they had a lot of force. And I was like, who are these? You know, and, like, they really brought the whole book kind of with them. Yeah. You know, but again, if I hadn't been sitting at the desk that particular day, you know, in whatever mood I was in or whatever, who knows if that would have happened at all.
I walked into a different cafe.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Thanks for answering that, folks. It's a lovely way to end a festival which has been celebrating Irish writing, just to show that Irish writers are a very diverse breed of characters. Like, I'm always intrigued that everyone comes at process differently, everyone's excited about different things. And so when it comes to pulling people together on a panel like this, you often get faced with the question that I've had preparing for this, which is, I adore these 3 books. I've read all of them twice now, but there's not a terrible amount of similarities between them. So I wanted to begin by maybe thinking about the theme of the panel, which has pulled you 3 together, to see if we can unpick that a little bit. So the panel's called Dark Heart, and I want it to begin with the dark part first of all. I've just come back from France, where an audience member at a reading said, "What is wrong with you Irish writers? You are always writing about the dark stuff." And I do think there is quite a lot of intense writing that comes out of our neck of the woods. I wonder if you could speak into that a little bit. You know, what is it about Irish writers that they are drawn to these quite intense themes sometimes? And you could start in, do you want to start, Una, to mix it up a wee bit?
I started to laugh when you were talking about that, because my husband always said, I'm from a large family, and if you sit with, like, I'm one of 8 children, and, like, if you sit with my family, he said someone's going to start talking about, like, eye operations or a terrible, like, murder that no one, you know, that he's Irish as well, but, like, my family must particularly enjoy that kind of storytelling. But I do think, I mean, I grew up in America, in an Irish American family. My family are from County Sligo, and we came to Sligo as children. My father had moved back. My parents got divorced when I was very young, and we'd come for summers. And there was so much of that sitting at the kitchen table, and my aunt was just that's what they did at night. There was this storytelling. I think there was 2 stations on that went off at like 11 or 10 on the telly, and there was always stories. And I think that I was always really drawn. I mean, I know it sounds cliche, but I think it's quite true that there was always sort of these stories that, whether they were hauntings or terrible things that happened, but I think that there's also great humor in Irish writing, and I think there's something about that balance between that line between what's dark and what's light, and maybe sometimes going to the dark allows you to see what's light as well. You know, and I would not in any way like to, because I've written a book that is about, you know, a woman who disappears, and it also is about domestic violence, and I wouldn't like to be like, oh, that in some macabre way that I was interested in making a spectacle of that, but in terms of the theme of the panel and the question, yet, you know, I do think that there's, that Irish story, people are drawn to stories, and inevitably there's both.
Colin?
Yeah, like I think like that thing is, it's a thing of, you know, I mean, on just a basic fundamental structural kind of level or something in storytelling, any story, you know, you have your once upon a time there was a something, and then something happens to knocks the status quo out of whack, and then the whole story is this kind of, you know, effort to recalibrate some kind of balance, whether it's restoring, in a more conservative story, it'll be restoring the order that was there, you know, at the beginning of the episode or whatever, you know, in formulaic TV, and then something a bit more kind of sophisticated, there will be, you know, some kind of change or whatever by the end. You know, so like, if you're gonna have something, that's just on a pure storytelling structural thing. If something is quite dark or intense or whatever, that's obviously going to generate more voltage for the story because it's just throwing things completely off balance, you know? But like, I think what you were saying is exactly right about this thing that it's not just about the dark, it's about the light. I think that there are certain books, you know, that like have a certain kind of tonal or emotional monotony because it is just this sort of relentless kind of dark sort of thing that's being hit over and over again, and eventually it just becomes this sort of like almost kind of pornographic, you know, catalogue of traumas or whatever. And some of those books do very well, you know. I'm not going to name their names, but you all know what they are, like big books. You know, like that's not interesting. I think like what's interesting is this tension of like between the light and the dark. I would think of someone like Roddy Doyle, for example, in which there's this great warmth in his work. Like when you read Roddy Doyle, there's this sense always of like, this is a book that likes people. You know, there's this sensibility there of warmth. But he can really, like, he can go way dark.
Yeah.
But the reason that it feels so dark is because of the tension with the light. You know, he has this like chiaroscuro effect or whatever, you know, where you've got like, you have light and dark kind of counterpointing one another, and that's obviously just dynamically much more interesting, you know.
Which is super interesting, Colin, because you've brought us into the next question, which I'll maybe bring Mike in on. The panel's not just called Dark Irish Writers, it's Dark Heart, and this idea of the juxtaposition of, you know, that just as you've outlined there, that you can write about really difficult, problematic things, but with a warmth to them. Like, I always think that there are writers who you can tell they don't like people.
Yes.
Like, I don't think Philip Roth liked people very much. Very good writer, but I think in all of these books there is that beautiful juxtaposition. So I wonder, Mike, where do you position yourself when you're approaching that to get the balance right between the heart and the darkness?
Yeah. I have to say, I think it's a bit Richard the French giving out given out about us, isn't it?
Yeah.
They're not such a ball of laughs themselves at that. But I don't know if you've heard that shocking trial that's been on in France for the last month, and that, like, Jesus Christ, it just beggars belief. But yeah, look, one of the things that governed my own work for years was that I saw a particular version of Ireland being written about, being put up on stages, and being sold abroad as a version of Ireland. And it was kind of a version of rural Ireland where I come from, and it was a version of rural Ireland where there was a lot of ignorance, and a lot of random violence, and a lot of kind of primitive feeling and that. And I think a lot of plays, and I think a lot of writers made hay with that sort of thing. And I took against that, because I was saying, you know what, that's actually not what it is. You know, I come from rural Ireland, and it's a place where people are kind and resourceful and smart, and they won't see you stuck. Now try and make a drama out of that. And that's a difficult challenge. That's what I thought was human decency. And that's what human decency and community and the lives of the individual within that. I was really interested in that, because I thought that's an original idea. People are decent, people are good, but how do we make a drama out of it and that? And that's what kind of governed that's largely, in a sense, it was that feeling that governed, Solar Bones. This is a decent man in a community who has given time and energy and work to his community. He's happily married. Make a drama out of that. And I thought that was actually everyone talks about the formal experiment everyone talks about the formal experiment of Solar Bones and that, but I didn't think that was the radical part. I thought the radical part about it was that here's a middle-aged decent man, happily married, content in his work. Can we write a story about him? That's what I thought was thing. So this notion of human decency and community and the individual at the heart of it, that's what I like that as a human being. So let's see, can we make a drama out of that? Now I had no difficulty with the other version of Ireland being sold, but it seemed to be the only story that people could tell. And when it becomes the only story, then it becomes wrong. And that's what I objected to. And my own work, I've tried to see it as a kind of counterweight to that kind of thing. And I don't know how successful that's been or anything, but this. So I have a fondness. I like my characters. Even this man Nealon at the heart of this new book, which owes a debt actually to French writing, particularly French noir. He is the most unknowable of all the characters that have done. I like him because he's governed by a wish to reclaim his family, to find wife and child and everything like that. So all of those things kind of come together in my work about a dark heart and about decency and humanity and light and all of that kind of thing. Those are the things that govern me. It's very interesting as well to hear someone in the last panel, someone talking about Tom Murphy, A Whistle in the Dark. And actually, A Whistle in the Dark is one of those tuning forks. Yeah, back in the early 90s when a couple of us were in our late 20s and early 30s hanging around together, and we were talking about this, that, and the next thing and that, and everyone was saying that the most unflattering picture of rural Ireland is A Whistle in the Dark, and it's also the best. It actually written his real heart and soul in that piece, and you could nearly divide the world into people who understood A Whistle in the Dark so I'm not squeamish about what we get up to in rural Ireland. I'm not squeamish about what we get up to, but I am squeamish when it becomes the only story told about it. That's what gets me.
I'm going to bring Colin in here, and really Calla very much follows on from what Mike has talked about exploring that kind of juxtaposition between human decency and terrible things that happen. And
Yeah.
Mike, in your novel, it feels much more centered on a person. In Calla, it feels like a whole community that we're seeing those two things play out together. So I wonder if you could set it in context and maybe give us a wee flavour of the writing.
Yeah, sure. So like, Calla tells the story of a group of friends who we follow as teenagers and as adults. And yeah, when they're teenagers, we're really following them for like the kind of summer of their lives, when they're going through all the classic adolescent thresholds, like the first love and the first kiss and the first time getting drunk. So all that kind of giddy, feverish, hormonal magic. And at the center of the group of friends is Calla. She's 15. She's like the leader of this group, the emotional core. But yeah, beneath the kind of smiling surface of their west coast of Ireland tourist town, there's this darkness that's constantly threatening to swallow the characters. And as the summer goes on, they're getting closer and closer to that darkness. And by the end of the summer, Calla goes missing. So 15 years later, 3 of the surviving members of that original group of friends find themselves thrown back together when human remains are found in the woods, and the past and the present begin to dramatically and violently collide. And normally I would read something that's like quite early in the book and from the teenage perspective. But given the theme of the event and just what you said there, I was kind of thinking, what would I read? I'll read something else that I haven't really read before, because it's about that kind of community thing. So this is when the 3 narrators of the book, there's Joe, who's become quite a famous musician, there's Mush, who has never left the town, and there's Helen, who was Calla's best friend, and she has also left the town, but they're all back together when the events of the adult timeline happen. So they've just met up for the first time in years, and Joe is very successful, he's very famous, and he's kind of led a sort of, like the Pied Piper, he's led some fans of his to a traditional Irish, traditional pub in the centre of town to like see the real Ireland, authentic Ireland. And so they've been drinking now for quite a while, so, all right. Sky's gone grey over the small car park and you push through the smokers. Helen's alone, sitting on a stone wall. You keep close to Mush, making sure he stays between you and her. She's barely looked at you tonight. You can tell she's drunk from the swim of her eyes as she tries some of Mush's pint. Mush is sweating. You should take a look inside there, Helen. The music's amazing. Are you serious? She says. Trad. A few of the Flanagan's crowd are lingering nearby, smoking, pretending not to listen. Adjust how you're sitting. They'll all remember the night they once saw Joe Brennan out drinking in Kinloch like an ordinary guy. 2 blondes, psyching each other up to approach you. One of them puts a hand on your arm. The usual script. Huge fans. Been listening to your stuff for, oh my God, years. American accent, English learned as a second language, Scandinavian, Greek, fuck it, they could be from anywhere. Did you grow up playing this sort of traditional music? One of them says. We don't have this where we are from, the other says. It must make you proud. You've had this conversation so many times it's autopilot. This music's who we are, you say. It's in our blood. Helen snorts into her pint. What, you say? You don't like trad? No, she laughs. And neither do you. Or has it become cool now? Ah, now, Mush says. Listen to them fiddles, Helen. Where's your pride? Reactionary kitsch, Helen says. You frown. It's authentic, romantic. There's a reason romantics always end up as fascists, Helen says. Appeals to authenticity are always rooted in essentialist thinking. She has not changed. One of the blondes touches your newest tattoo. In a quiet voice, she says, I think it's so beautiful. Sentimental dog shit, Helen mutters. Mush nudges her. Nothing wrong with that every now and then, Helen. Bit of emotion. Sentimentality is for people who want the luxury of an emotion without paying any price for it. Oh, that's very clever, Helen, you say. That's Oscar Wilde, Joe. Terrible to be cynical. I'm cynical, she says. This country invents a fake past, packages it for tourists as a product, and then cons itself into believing that somehow it's all real. When the reality of this place, this is Helen, you say to the blondes. She used to be fairly intense, but she's really mellowed out over the reality of this place, Helen says, leaning forward, is that people here will turn a blind eye to every sort of horror for the sake of a quiet life. And this is the music they use to tell themselves stories about how, actually, they're the great victims of history, when the truth is, Helen, Mush says, I mean, the hypocrisy, she says, frowning into your pint over some cliched shit about the brutal Brits, congratulating yourself for your innocence, squeezing out a few cheap tears before staggering home to beat the wife. Jesus, Helen, take it easy, Mush says. I hate this music, and I hate this place, Helen says. How can a country so self-absorbed never even come close to actual introspection? Helen, Mush drones painfully. Helen! Mush gets her in a headlock and she starts to punch him in the side. They squabble like that, like siblings, rolling over on their sides. Helen starts laughing. Helen! Mush shouts. The blondes are bewildered, more flustered by the happy violence between Helen and Mush than anything Helen has actually said.
Colin, I was going to ask you something completely different, but when you read that passage, which I love, it's very funny, can I ask you about there's a lot of this book that's about nostalgia. It's older, like not older people, but older young people looking back at their youth with this kind of nostalgia. And I wanted to ask you about that, how you keep the balance between, like, because some of the things they're remembering they're not great.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about the role of nostalgia in your work and memory?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like nostalgia is something that like naturally I'd be kind of suspicious of because of the fact that like we're living in an extremely nostalgic moment in every sense, whether it's like the constant reboots of old films and TV shows and this franchising of all culture and then this sort of reactionary turn to making America great again and reclaiming the blitz spirit of Brexit Britain and all this like rubbish, you know. So like there is this kind of romantic projection onto the past. But the reason that like, and you know, it's a tendency I would have myself to be quite like, you know, longing or yearning for something. And I think the reason that the past can be so attractive and compelling in that way is that like at the core of like what it is to live in time is the fact that like time is like this constitutive wound at the core of everything. It constitutes everything, it makes everything possible, it makes everything happen. But it's also this wound through which everything is constantly disappearing, everything's constantly fading. And I think nostalgia is a condition where you look back on the past and you imagine it as a time where that wound wasn't there. Which is why, like, a lot of the time the past is about, or nostalgia is about erasing all the problematic or all the kind of irreconcilable parts of the past. Just like thumbing out all those rough edges, all those kind of sharp corners and making it something that seemed like that was a time when everything was reconciled to itself. It was whole. Life had been consummated, and now we're in this fallen, brittle period or whatever. And it was very important to me that like the book kind of had that thing where you do have that kind of that romantic summer, that idyllic summer that everyone probably had when they were a teenager in some form or another. But even within that, there's real like horror, you know. And then I didn't want it to be this thing where like, because you can recapitulate the logic of nostalgia by kind of having a thing where the past is this lovely warm-colored sepia-toned thing and the present is this cold, brittle kind of atomized thing. And that is there within the narrators. But of course the tension of the novel is can they kind of break out of that? And that was something I wanted to counterpoint with like other characters where you can see that in the past they're much more fractured or broken than they are now, like 15 years later. There are members of like the parents' generation who, when you see them, you know, in 2003, they're in a very bad way. And then you see that they've kind of gone through this sort of healing of some sort by 2018. So I wanted to have those things in tension all the time. You know, that's what, again, like it's kind of getting back to what we were saying before about tension.
The flip sides of
things. Yeah,
things,
this dialectical kind of thing, yeah.
I think it's a super interesting novel to me because Calla, the person of Calla, this girl who no one knows what happened to her, and we find out slowly, she's the kind of linchpin of it. She's not a present character, and actually all of you have absent characters in your novels, which we might come back to in a minute. And actually, I thought it was a really wonderful exploration of different masculinities. So Mish, who you read there, I just love him. He's just such a likable character. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the different kinds of masculinities that you're exploring in this novel.
Yeah, I mean, like, it was definitely not like a conscious thing that I was doing or whatever, but, like, I wouldn't even have been consciously thinking thematically in terms of, like, masculinity, but there are, there's two male narrators and one female narrator, Helen, and then there are lots of, like, there's a wide cast of characters in the book as well, and let's say, for example, with somebody like Joe, who's like the successful musician, and all of his stuff is narrated in the second person. It's all you this, you that, you. For him, he's someone who would be occupying a kind of, when he's a teenager, when he's a kid, he's like this kind of golden boy. He would be sort of like the sort of alpha male sort of figure, in the sense that, like, he's smart and he's talented and he's comes from a good family and he's got ambition and he has the capability to realize his ambitions and things like that. But he's also someone who's, like, completely within the symbolic order of his community. He's in the role of like a prince. And then as an adult, he's actually become extremely successful and famous. So he's almost like a king. People really do kind of worship him in some sort of way. But the problem is that, like, even if you're the king or the prince in a symbolic order, you're still playing a role within the symbolic order. And Joe is someone who, like, his face is grown into the mask of the role, and the mask is beginning to devour his face. And in many ways, I think a lot of the characters, but the questions about the masculinities, in different ways, I think a lot of the men in the book are kind of, that tension between the face and the mask is like, is this constant thing that, like, it's there throughout the whole book. I think it's in every character really, but there's different sort of roles that are expected of you as a man socially.
And there's physical masks in the novel as well.
Yes, yeah. And, exactly. Like, so that was a kind of motif that I wanted to kind of keep playing with throughout the book is there is that tension about, like, and the mask may not even be something that you have in a social community. It might be even within your family or what people expect of you. Like, and the way that, like, a character like Mush would have definitely internalized a certain idea of who he is as a person, that as the book goes on, you see kind of begins to get, like, more and more circumstances force him more and more to kind of push against this thing that he's internalized about himself as well. I'm trying, like, to speak in a really indirect way to avoid any spoilers, but yeah.
And you're doing very well at it, and I'm going to try and do it as well. I'm going to bring the other two in here. I'm really glad that you talked a little bit about time in your novel, and all of you are doing really interesting things with time. Una, you're moving across different kind of planes in time. You, Mike, are kind of stretching time. There's something really interesting going on with, like, the time in the cottage feels like it's longer than it actually is sometimes. Can I ask you a little bit about what time does in your novels? And I'll start with you, Colin, because you know, why did you choose to go backwards and forwards kind of like that?
One of the things that, like, inspired that thing of, like, it's like there's two time frames, you're going back and forth between the teenage and adult versions of the characters. And one of the things that I wanted to do with that is that just purely, this is like purely on a, like, narrative, like, storytelling level, there's great tension that you can derive from that because of the fact that you can see the consequences in the present of things that haven't yet happened in the past, but you don't really know what those things are yet. So immediately that already creates a certain amount of kind of narrative propulsion. but also it was just this thing where, like, in the last panel, like Claire Wills was talking about the way that, you know, things that have happened in the past in Ireland, you know, she was talking about mother and baby homes and things like that, that, like, they're not just something that happened in some linear timeline that you can say, okay, that happened back then and now it's over. You know, people carry that within themselves, like what is being consciously articulated or not, you know, these things that you can kind of, that you carry with you. And that's the thing, that all these characters in some way are, the adult versions of these characters are in some way haunted by their younger selves. They're all trapped in a certain way in the amber of their younger selves. They're circling these wounds that were inflicted upon them when they were at this younger, more open, kind of impressionable age. So the past it is always present, you know, it is that, like, Faulkner line about the past isn't even past.
Yeah.
But that was the thing, was you know, there's a tension in that too, of like, how much are you willing to, how much do you concede to the past in terms of, like, what you're doing now? Like, how much do you allow that to determine you, or how much do you fight back against it, or, like, face it in order to confront it and try to resolve something? So that's, like, a tension that in many ways, like, a lot of the different characters in the book are kind of having that conflict with themselves and time.
Mike, I'll maybe come to you next, because we're going to focus on Una. What is time doing in your work? How do you approach it?
I think I'm back in. It's over nearly 30 years ago that I heard Margaret Atwood giving a talk in Galway. She was at the end of a world tour, and probably something around the time of The Blind Assassin or something. And I remember her standing up at a lectern, saying, and she defined her novel. She says it's a long piece of imaginative prose with a clock in it. And that the turning of time was really everything that any book was about. And that's my own feeling. My characters are incredibly conscious of time, and I seem to be incredibly conscious of time. Well, I'm conscious of it when I sit down to write. I think I don't know about my fellow writers here, but I'm a different person when I sit down to write. I just turn into a completely different human being when I turn down to. And sometimes the questions that what happens to me as a writer as I sit writing is completely different to the way I live my life normally. I don't agonize about time in the way or the degree that my books do. But certainly there does seem to be a preoccupation with it. I think in my first novel, Crow's Requiem, time is mentioned 6 or 7 times on the first page. Wow. Okay, and I do know that the passage of time, that I have this incredible desire and wish to demark it, and to note its passing, and to note the effect that it has. I'm constantly talking about the body as something that it marks time, and in which is marked by time.
Is that an amazing scene in the book where he looks at his body and?
Oh yeah, where he does this. He goes looking for the bug in his body and that. Yeah, that was my take on. There's a scene in the book where Neelan becomes convinced that he is being monitored, and that there's some sort of surveillance implant in his body and that, and he gives himself a kind of a fingertip search all over his body, right down from top of his head right down to his toes, as far up his back, and all over himself as far as he can go. And that's my take on. Anyone remember the movie The Conversation with? Anyone remember the movie The Conversation with Coppola's movie with who was it again? This actor?
Gene Hackman.
Gene Hackman. Remember that amazing end scene where he's just so descended into paranoia that he has ripped up his own flat and that. And I think, how far could I bring that? Could it be brought any further? And this is my attempt at refining that final scene of Coppola's movie and that, where he tries to take himself apart actually. But it has got me. The passage on the marking of time has got me into can get me into awful trouble. Just for anyone starting out writing, try and ignore time, because it'll screw you up in terms of getting dates and birthdays and all sorts of timelines. You'll spend an awful lot of time agonizing about, have I got those into alignment? Are they correct? Do they correspond with what's happening in the real world and that? And you can outsmart yourself in those sort of things, and I've done it a couple of times. But it does seem to be, time. We move through time. We are time. The closest timekeeping device to us is there in our chest, and that we are. And I'm always a great. I love the body as a temporal narrative. I'm always seeing it in myself now. The scars of time in my own body and all of that. So I don't know, is that odd? Am I odd in that? I don't think so. It seems to me to be a human enough preoccupation to do, and that it doesn't seem to me to be an odd thing that this would work itself out in my fiction.
Your novel is set weeks, each chapter is a different time frame. Could you give us a little bit of an introduction to it, and then maybe give us a wee sample of what it sounds like?
Yeah, so the book, it does have sort of two chronologies. The book is about a woman who goes to work one morning, leaves her house, and doesn't arrive at work. She leaves in the dawn. And she's living with her sister and her 4-year-old daughter. She's estranged from her partner, and the weekend that she disappears, the child is with the partner. And she doesn't turn up, and the father who has the child with him ends up taking the child to, it's set in Philadelphia, the first part. He takes the child to Vermont, where he brings her up in a very kind of isolated rural environment. And the book kind of works between the aunt who was living with the child and the sister. Her name is Nessa. And Nessa narrates one version, and the other timeline is told by Ruby, the little girl who's 4 when her mother disappears. And she believes that her mother left her. She doesn't even remember that she lived in Philadelphia. She's lived with her father. Her father has told her about all of her memories. And so she thinks that she's always lived there and that her mother left her when she was 2. But she also does have memories. Sometimes they're like sensations, or she hears people talking about water ice once, and it's a real Philadelphia thing. Water ice is a flavored. It's not an ice cream. It's like flavored ice, and she can feel it in her mouth. And she has sort of memories that surface. And so I think rather than so much agonizing about time, I think I agonized about memory and how the memory of the mother is erased by the father who's rearing her, because you can lay down false memories. I'm going to read a really short part, and I was thinking about that, which kind of relates to this. And it's because this is from Ruby, who's been reared in Vermont by her father. She was being homeschooled. He kept her very isolated, but from a distance, the aunt was writing letters to say, he hasn't submitted his curriculum to the state. She should be socializing with other children, and he's forced to send her to school. And so she's at this point in the novel. She is in 7th grade, so she's about 12 years old. She's grown up not off grid, but she hunts, and they grow their own vegetables, and they're quite self-reliant. But I'm going to read a part that happens in sort of late November, early December, just before Christmas. And so I just thought this was kind of the time of year, and also because I think the subject matter around the past and erasure fits. Miss Tierney put Christmas lights up in the English language and arts room. She said it helped to have extra lights coming into the darkest days. The whole 7th grade had been assigned a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, and they discussed it while the lights twinkled along the walls. Ruby had never read someone's real account of their own life and experiences. She hadn't been able to put it down and read all 11 chapters in one go. Frederick Douglass didn't know when he was born. Slave owners never told their slaves their birthdays. He didn't know any slaves who knew their date of their birth. Most didn't even know their mothers. He described how his had been taken away from him when he was an infant, a thing that was a common practice in that part of Maryland, usually before the child was a year old. Douglass wrote that he did not know why they did this except to blunt and destroy the relationship. Douglass's mother was sent to work as a field hand 12 miles away. She used to walk back at night to the farm where he was and hold him in the dark. Then she would get up and walk back the 12 miles to be working in the field on the other farm by sunrise. Ruby thought of the young Frederick Douglass, what that must have been like for him as a child, to have this person come and hold you at night, a body safe and familiar and so full of love for you that they would come all that distance just to have the opportunity to hold you while you drifted off to sleep. Douglass's mother died when he was maybe 7. Ruby's lungs ached when she read that, as if she had run a fast race in freezing air temperatures.
Anna, I want to ask you a couple of specific questions about your book. One of the things that I think you do really well, and I'm going to really try hard not to do this with any spoilers, is that you write women really convincingly who we want them to have more agency, and they're moving towards agency, but it's maybe not happening as quickly as we would want it to. Can you talk a little bit about writing that, women and autonomy and how difficult it is to make it believable? But you're saying a lot in this book, I think.
Yeah, so Nessa is narrating really the story of her sister's relationship with this man, Lucas. And, it was a relationship with coercive control, there was violence. And I suppose one of the frustrating things for Nessa and her family is, why doesn't Dina leave? Why does she stay in this relationship? They open the door for her over and over again. She has a family that gets it and is willing to shelter her, and still she doesn't go. And I think it's a question that's often asked, and I think there's so many reasons that go beyond financial or shelter.
Even the grandmother as well. Like, I wanted to shake her at times.
So I think it was important to be honest about, and there's been all kinds of that learned helplessness in these things if you're in an abusive relationship and what that can do to you. But she does leave, and really the most dangerous times for a woman in a difficult relationship are when she's leaving or when she has left. And so I think Nessa's frustration with her sister and the way that the family begin to avoid it because they want access to the child and they don't want to alienate her. I felt like I had to try to understand and write that truthfully. And then Clover is the grandmother. She's Ruby's grandmother, and she's the mother of Lucas, the estranged partner who's rearing his daughter. And the mother knows. She may not know that she knows, but she knows. And she herself has always lived with difficult men and has been cowed a lot of her life. And her story over the course of this child being brought into her life, this beauty of a child in her when she's been living alone and she's always been with men, and she also gets a friend in the course of the novel, and I think that moves her towards a kind of agency where she makes some really dramatic decisions. And I mean, one of the difficult things I found is when I was writing the book, you know, I wrote Lucas tender moments, and that was hard. But I wanted, he's Ruby's father, he's rearing her, and there are moments where, you know, there's a reason why she absolutely, you know, worships him and thinks that he has all the answers, because he's her father and he's introduced her to nature particularly. And so there were scenes like where they, you know, he mail orders chicks, and they rear chicks together. And even when the chicks arrive, there's one dead, but he tries to hide that from her, protect her from death. And, you know, he's new. I hope he's nuanced. I didn't want him to just to be a kind of villainous character. But I think Ruby's agency, her own agency, maybe in part has also come from the way that she's been reared. And yeah, so, I mean, yeah, I think female agency was really important to me, but it's not just like, oh, I wish I could have some agency and go and fix my life, you know, like.
It's hard to write.
Yeah.
It's hard to get that balance between believability and also something that people will actually feel invested and aspire to in a way. And I think you do it so well and so subtly in this novel. I love that you mentioned those moments there with Lucas and Ruby in nature, because as well as being an incredibly gripping thriller, this is a beautiful portrayal of Vermont and the landscape and the nature. And you talked earlier about going down a rabbit hole of flora and fauna. Can you talk a little bit about where that came from and how it shaped the novel?
Yeah, I think in both books I've written, I think maybe it's just, I mean, Mike was talking earlier about, like, you know, we kind of return to the same themes, and I realize in both books I've written that they open with a sister getting into a car and disappearing, and that literally never occurred to me until it was said to me in an environment like this. Someone in the audience said it, and I was like, what? You know, and it's so obvious. But in both books, I think nature became really, because maybe it's important to me and it's how I respond to the world. And I had spent a lot of time in Vermont, and I was supposed to be spending 2 weeks in Vermont and flying on the 20th of April, 2020, to spend 2 weeks with this guy. He's a hunter, fisherman, and COVID happened. So I spent a lot of time reading, like, every kind of book on Vermont. I mean, I'd spent a lot of time on Lake Champlain, where part of the book is set. So I knew some of those islands quite intimately because I'd paddled. And my brother was a caretaker, a bit like The Shining. He was a caretaker on an island with this person who was like a trust fund baby who started to go a bit, I should be careful. But my brother had lived on an island out there, and so we'd spent some time on paddling around those islands, and I knew it quite well.
And that detail really comes across in the novel. It made me want to go to Vermont despite what was happening there. Mike, we're going to come to you now. I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit of the context of your novel and maybe give us a wee sample of a piece from it.
Sure, yeah. I was going to read the beginning, but you told me you'd heard that 3 times already. So I'm going to.
I only meant that in a cheeky way.
I'm going to shift it, and because it has a kind of a tangential relevance to this city. I was born in, like many another Mayo man of my generation. I was actually born in London, and I spent the first 3 or 4 years in this city. And my dad was a navvy, and my mum was a tatty hawker. It still amazes me that I'm a generation down from effectively migrant workers. But at the age of 4, I went home to. At the age of 4, I was brought home to my mum's place in North Mayo, a small village out in the Irish Peninsula called Dahoma, and at the end of the summer, when my parents were elected to go back to London and that, I put up my hand and I said, I'm sound here. You go on ahead, and I'll wait here with Granny and Grandad. And it amazes me that I stayed with them for 2.5 years in that, and I remember it being, it's a period of my life that becomes more vivid to me the older I get, and more valuable and more valuable and more not idyllic, but just a really beautiful interlude in my life. And I followed my grandfather around. I followed him around like a little puppy, and he seemed to me to be a giant. He seemed to me to be a giant, so much so that when he died in the 80s and that, I was talking to my brother and sister about it, and he was so tall. And I used to see him going, oh, geez, this big tall man. And they're looking at each other going, what are you talking about? Grandad was only 5'2". But to me, in my childish imagination, he was about 7 foot tall. He could block out the sun. But one of the things I remembered was this incident here. And this is Neelan retelling this incident. It's a tiny incident, and anyone from a rural background has done this 100 times. But Neelan is going around the old home place, and he's reminiscing about his father. And so he goes down to the shed, and there's a pair of Wellingtons in the shed standing inside the door, the twin bores gaping up at him, and a rivulet of sand drains away in a thin feather when he turns them upside down. The cold of them rises up into his spine, so it takes a moment standing there in the damp smell of the shed before they warm up and he moves off. The sheds around him stand empty, with the desolate air of structures that have lost their true purpose of men and animals moving through them. Light falls like dust in the narrow space between the barn and the dairy. And the door of the calf shed is shut, the right-angled hasp on the jamb browned and smoothed against the lead paint. It opens with that bird groan of metal and wood coming apart. It's the sound of a beacon from an age when things were simpler, when locks and doors were fitted with maximal regard for what they were about and nothing else. He lowers his head to duck inside. The interior is gloomy. The window barred, blocked up with a sheet of galvanized held in place with a length of 4x2 wedged diagonally into the narrow recess. A plastic dosing bottle stands on the sill, yellowed, speckled like a small effigy in its own commemorative grotto. Overhead there's a hay fork wedged into the rafters in the corrugated roof. The smell of the place, dried cow shit, hay, timber, fills him with his whole childhood. The years fall away, and he's now a child moving through these outbuildings, the old smell, the old light. Any moment now, he will hear his father call his name, see him come around the corner, walking towards him. He steps back out into the yard and walks through the hay shed, the curved space over his head holding the still air within. Old hay is banked against the far wall. It's grey and mouldy now. A wad of black silage cover lies deflated in the middle of the floor. The whole assemblage looks like a carefully staged memorial, a site-specific installation to a way of life gone completely, a way of life that would now revolve beyond these parts. How many times has he stood in this hay shed with his father to shelter from a passing shower, standing together and listening in silence to the rain falling on the galvanized roof, hearing the whole structure hum in a single continuous note. Such moments always seem to hang outside of time, suspended intervals within their lives together on their small farm. And as the rain fell on the young Neelan sometimes wondered if this same rain might have fallen through the same angle and light across his life from the day of his birth. And if so, was it a sorrow or a consolation? And he remembers also how his mood once moved him once as a child to an embarrassing tautology. Watching the rain falling across the fields in thick swathes, he was startled to hear him say out loud, "That's wet rain," spoken as if there was a chance there could be any other kind. And his voice hung in the soft light, invoking some infinite foolishness, until his father, apparently seeing nothing redundant in what he had said, doubled on it and said, that is wet rain," and then added for good measure, "and never an end to it."
I'm glad you read that bit. Mike, just listening to you there, it strikes me that you're a very generous writer, the way you write, it's almost painterly, and it invites the reader in to kind of decide how they see the scene, what they make of it themselves. Your books, to me, aren't books that are rushing to tell us what to think. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of leaving that space for the reader, that degree of ambiguity in how you write.
When I think it goes back to my 20s when I began to write. I found myself in a milieu in which I was the only writer. Everyone around me was a visual artist. I was the only writer among painters, sculptors, people with cameras making video movies and things like that. So I gained another education from them. They taught me how to see color, how to see light, how to see the movement of color and light. So that became a big kind of a preoccupation, and it was an incredible. I didn't meet a writer until I was 30 years of age. The day I signed my contract with Jonathan Cape, that was the first day I met a writer. His name was Robert Robertson. He was a poet sitting across the table from me and that. And but up to then, my education had all been among painters and sculptors and visual artists. So it seems to be the way that I certainly took on board. I took on board what they did and how they did it, and I rejected an awful lot of what they did, because the way they go about their work is something I find infinitely baffling, and that. But I would always be extremely grateful for this time that I spent with them, and for the kind of the way they pointed me towards another way of looking at the world and that. So that was a hugely informative experience, and whether that has led to, I don't know, space or ambiguity or generosity, I've written quite a bit about my family, not that much, but enough to draw down wrath if people were wrathful. And it hasn't happened, and it's because I've developed what I'd like to think was a fond gaze. You talked about a writer who likes people. I wouldn't like to go praising myself too much, but I'd like to think that I got on with people, so I'd like to think that comes across. In my work.
Do you think about your readers when you're writing?
No, I have no thoughts at all about my readers. But that's not to say, my allegiance is to my book when I'm writing. My allegiance is to the book. And I'm always asking my book, show me the shape you want to take. Show me the structure you want to take. I'll get out of the way. I have no interest in leaving my fingerprints. I have no interest in self-expression. I have no interest in myself. Just you show me the way you want to be. If you could birth yourself without me, show me that shape, and that's the shape I will give you. And this is a serious question that I'm continually asking the book I'm writing. That said, the books that do make themselves known to me seem to need authorial readers. My books are completed by my readers. There is, Solar Bones had to be punctuated by readers. Certainly, Notes from a Coma had to be structured and reread by readers and that. And right from the very beginning, one of my first stories was The Occupation: A Guide for Tourists, and that is effectively a multiple choice, make your own adventure story, which is a very playful construct. So while I don't give my readers much thought, which is a very different thing to saying I am hugely grateful for my readers, but I don't give them any thought. But my books seem to give them a lot of thought. My books seem to need authorial readers and that. So,
folks, we are coming towards the end of our time, but I have just been given the nod that we're allowed to ask 2 questions. So the first people to get their hands up really quickly can ask a question. Who's got one for our wonderful panel here? There's one right at the back, just to test the microphone runner. Let's see, one is coming to you right now.
Just very quickly, I wondered what time has done to you, Jan, and the other authors in terms of changing you as a writer?
Oh, I'm going to make sure these three answer because it's their panel. So I'll start with Colin at the end. What has time done to you as a writer?
Jesus. I don't know about time. I mean, like, I'm still, it's very early days. Like, for me, I've only just, like, published the first novel. So, you know, I think, like, the big kind of, like, the big change or whatever is that kind of, that step from, like, you know, it being this kind of dream that you've been working towards, and your work has always been this very intimate, like, just you in a Word document for, you know, years at a time, and then it becoming this, like, literally a physical object that has its own kind of existence in the world, and it's away from you. And then you also, I remember, like, the Irish writer Nicole Flattery talking about this, that she said, like, you lose your innocence in that moment. Like, suddenly, it's like when you like, up until that point, the door is closed and you're just in this really intimate space, and then the door opens and you can't get everyone out again, you know? You have people's voices in your head now. You have people's perceptions of what you're doing in your head. And that's something that, like, right now, like, where I am in my own kind of writing life or whatever, that's something that I am really trying to kind of fight against, is just fighting against the good and the bad of having, like, the gaze. Because even if people are saying really positive things to you, that's also, like, can be really destructive, because then you're, like, trying to write towards their expectations, which is just a artistically disastrous thing to do. So I would say, like, that's, like, right now, I think that's, like, this conscious thing that I'm aware of. Like, I didn't have to deal with that before, you know. Yeah.
Una?
Yeah, I came to writing really quite late in my life. So I guess at one level I feel my mortality quite profoundly, because I feel awake since I've been writing. And the year I went down to Galway, where Mike teaches on the MA program, was the first time in my life where I basically said no to other people and ring-fenced myself and wrote. And I'd worked on journals, I'd done all kinds of work related to writing, but it was a really important moment. But I also think that maybe time and having gone through things in my life also maybe has fed the writing. But at the moment I feel kind of urgency sometimes of wanting to have written books and to be included and worry about time. Sorry, it's a very morbid answer, but yeah, just.
One of the ways that time has affected me getting older is the soundtrack to my books, and my writing has completely changed. When I wrote my first collection of short stories and into my second book, the soundtrack was Scandinavian death metal and that kind of thing, like, you know, loud, splenetic rage. And latterly, it is moved onto Hank Williams and George Jones. The tales have become mellower, the voices have become a lot mellower, and that it's become very evident to me. I've had to look for lyrics. I've had to buy the rights to lyrics twice in my life, and one was at the beginning of my career, and I had to go to Faith No More to get lyrics from two lines of lyrics from Angel Dust, and that was easy. They were really nice about it, and it cost about 10 quid to get 3 or 4 lines of Angel Dust, and 20 years later, I had to go for John Denver, which is a change in tone, and some days are diamonds, some days are stones, some days the heartache won't leave me alone, and that's been the change. And that one was absolute penance to get the rights for. It was penance, and it was expensive, seriously expensive. So just a word to you: if you're thinking of writing books and you're thinking of pillaging the American songbook, don't do it. It'll break you. But that's one of the things that different tenor. Now I'm middle aged. What? Not middle aged. As someone says to me, middle age your arse. You're not going to live to be 118. You're fucking old. so.
I don't know nowadays. You never know.
Yeah, maybe I don't know. Yeah.
I have some sad news. We're talking about time, and unfortunately, our time has gone. But what I can say is that these three wonderful authors are going to be outside signing books, and the books are for sale, and they have enormous amounts of time. They can stay for the rest of the evening and answer all your questions. Folks, it has been absolutely wonderful to chat to these three. So can you put your hands together for Colin Walsh and Mannion?
John, thank you.
Thank you, our panel. Thank you, Jan Carson, for the wonderful hosting, and to you for being here. Good night.